Freezing in a dilapidated cabin, Archer had been abandoned by his wealthy family with nothing but their mockery and a heavily rusted iron chest. He assumed the rusty lockbox was the final, cruel punchline to his pathetic life. But when the brittle hinges finally gave way, the contents he uncovered didn't just rewrite his destiny, they changed history forever. The mahogany-paneled conference room in downtown Seattle felt more like a courtroom than a lawyer's office. Rain lashed against the floor-to-ceiling windows, blurring the city skyline into a smear of gray. Archer Pendleton sat in the corner, tugging at the frayed cuffs of his only suit. At 32, Archer looked a decade older. His hands were calloused and stained with engine oil from his failing auto repair shop, and his posture carried the heavy burden of his late mother's crushing medical debts. Across the wide, polished table sat the people who shared his blood, but nothing else. His cousin, William Croft, leaned back in a plush leather chair, idly checking his Rolex. William was a hedge fund manager whose smirk seemed permanently etched into his face. Next to him was Aunt Beatrice, draped in cashmere and smelling aggressively of expensive perfume, looking at Archer as if he were a stray dog that had wandered indoors. They were all gathered for the final estate reading of Theodore Pendleton, Archer's grandfather. Theodore had been an eccentric man, a former deep-sea marine salvage expert who had spent the last 20 years of his life isolated in the mountains, alienated from his family, rambling about historical anomalies and lost colonial records. The family thought he was completely insane. David Sander, a high-priced estate attorney with a voice like dry gravel, cleared his throat and adjusted his spectacles. Let us proceed. Theodore's estate is complex, but the directives are quite clear. The reading began predictably. William, the golden boy of the family, inherited the sprawling, lucrative commercial properties Theodore still owned in Portland. Aunt Beatrice was handed a diversified portfolio of blue-chip stocks that practically guaranteed her a third vacation home in the Hamptons. They smiled, exchanged knowing glances, and nodded with the grim satisfaction of vultures picking clean a carcass. Then, Sander paused. He looked down at the parchment, then up at Archer. A subtle look of pity flashed across the lawyer's eyes. "To my grandson, Archer," Sander read, his voice dropping a decibel, "who always understood the value of hard work, but rarely the value of looking beneath the surface. I leave my property on the northern ridge of the Cascade Mountains, and the solitary item contained within its basement, the chest." William barked a laugh, slamming his hand on the table. "The cabin? The one with the collapsing roof and the black mold? And what chest? Are we talking about Grandpa's garbage bin?" Sander signaled to a clerk standing by the heavy oak doors. The doors swung open, and two men struggled to wheel in a heavy-duty dolly. Resting on it was an object that made Aunt Beatrice physically recoil and press a handkerchief to her nose. It was a chest, roughly 3 feet long and 2 feet wide, but it looked like a chunk of debris dredged from the bottom of the ocean. It was entirely encased in a thick, bubbled crust of deep orange rust, calcified barnacles, and hardened sea grime. It was brutally ugly, smelling faintly of rotting kelp and oxidized iron. There was no visible keyhole, no hinges that hadn't been fused shut by decades of corrosion. It looked less like a container and more like a solid block of metallic decay. "Is this a joke?" Archer whispered. Standing up and approaching the rusted monstrosity, he placed a hand on it. It was freezing cold and rough as sandpaper. "I assure you, it is not," Sander said softly. "Your grandfather stipulated that this and the cabin are your sole inheritance. The cabin is entirely off the grid. The chest weighs nearly 200 pounds. William wiped a tear of laughter from his eye. "Congratulations, Artie. You're the proud owner of a rusty box of dirt and a condemned shack. Don't spend it all in one place. If you need a few bucks for gas to haul that piece of junk to the scrapyard, let me know." Archer's face burned. He was 2 weeks away from being evicted from his apartment. The bank was threatening to repossess his shop's equipment. He had come here hoping for a lifeline, a few $1,000s to keep the lights on, maybe pay off the aggressive collection agencies. Instead, he was being handed a heavy, rusted anchor to drag him down faster. "I'll take it," Archer said, his voice trembling with a mixture of rage and profound humiliation. It took Archer, the 2 clerks, and a rented winch just to get the chest into the bed of his beat-up Ford F-150. As he drove away from the gleaming glass towers of the legal district, his phone buzzed. It was his landlord. The eviction was final. He had 48 hours to vacate his apartment. With no money, no home, and a 200-pound cube of rusted iron sitting in his truck bed, Archer had only one place to go: the rotting inheritance in the Cascade Mountains. He was driving straight into the most brutal winter the Pacific Northwest had seen in a century. The drive up the mountain was treacherous. The paved roads gave way to gravel, and the gravel gave way to deeply rutted, mud-slicked logging trails. By the time Archer reached the property, the sun had dipped below the tree line, plunging the dense pine forest into an eerie, freezing twilight. William hadn't been exaggerating about the cabin. It was a miserable, decaying structure of dark, waterlogged timber leaning heavily to one side. The porch sagged, the windows were clouded with filth, and the roof was missing several shingles, exposing the tar paper underneath. Archer spent his first 3 days in pure survival mode. The temperature plummeted to 15 degrees Fahrenheit, the cabin had no electricity and no running water. He had spent his last $50 on a few meager supplies: bulk rice, a dozen cans of beans, matches, a cheap axe, and a few gallons of drinking water. If he didn't secure firewood, he would freeze to death in his sleep. He worked from dawn to dusk, his breath pluming in the icy air, chopping dead wood from the surrounding forest. His hands blistered and bled, the cold seeping into his bones. His meals consisted of half-cooked rice and cold beans eaten straight from the tin. At night, he huddled in a sleeping bag in front of the stone hearth, the only source of heat in the drafty room. And sitting right in the center of the warped wooden floorboards was the chest. It became his obsession. By the 4th day, the silence of the mountain began to close in on him, and the rusted box became a focal point for all his anger, grief, and desperation. Why would his grandfather leave him this? Was it a final cruel punishment for not visiting enough? Archer started with a crowbar. He wedged the curved steel against what he assumed was the seam of the lid and threw his entire body weight onto it. The crowbar slipped, sending Archer crashing into the floorboards, scraping his elbow raw. The chest didn't even dent, the rust was as hard as concrete. Next, he tried a heavy steel mallet and a chisel. He spent hours striking the sides, hoping to chip away the corrosion and find a locking mechanism. Clang, clang, clang. The metallic ringing echoed through the empty woods, a lonely, desperate sound. He managed to knock loose a few chunks of barnacles and orange dust, but the iron beneath was fused solid. By the end of his first week, the situation turned dire. A massive low-pressure system stalled over the Cascades. The sky turned a bruised purple, and the snow began to fall. Not a light dusting, but a blinding, ferocious whiteout. Within 24 hours, 4 feet of snow had piled up against the cabin doors. The wind howled through the cracks in the walls like a dying animal. Archer was trapped. His firewood pile was dwindling fast. His food was nearly gone. He began rationing himself to a few spoonfuls of beans a day. Hunger clawed at his stomach, making him dizzy and weak. The cold was a physical presence in the room, pressing against his skin. He started tearing up the floorboards from the adjacent bedroom, chopping them up to feed the fire. As the blizzard raged outside, Archer's sanity began to fray. He sat wrapped in his sleeping bag, staring at the chest illuminated by the flickering, dying firelight. "What's in there, old man?" Archer croaked, his voice hoarse from disuse. "Rocks? More rust? You sent me here to die." In a fit of delirious rage, fueled by starvation and the biting frost nip turning his fingertips white, Archer grabbed the handle of the rusted chest. He dragged it, straining every muscle in his weakened back, screaming through his teeth until it was sitting directly inside the massive stone hearth, right against the roaring flames. "If I can't open you," Archer panted, collapsing onto the floor, "I'll melt you down." He piled the last of his chopped floorboards around the heavy iron box, creating a massive, blazing pyre. The fire roared, the flames licking over the calcified rust and barnacles. For 2 hours, Archer watched, feeding the fire with an old broken chair he found in the corner. Then, something incredible happened. The intense, localized heat began to affect the decades-old corrosion. The thermal expansion of the heavy iron beneath the crust caused the outer layer of rust to crack. It started with a loud pop, followed by a sound like a gunshot. Archer scrambled back as a massive chunk of rusted slag exploded off the front of the chest, landing in the ashes. Through the smoke and the flames, Archer saw it. Beneath the heavy layer of decay, the front of the chest wasn't flat. The fire had burned away the grime to reveal a massive, intricate brass dial, green with oxidation, but clearly machined with incredible precision. It wasn't just a chest. It was a maritime safe. And etched into the brass dial, faintly glowing in the firelight, were coordinates. Archer grabbed a heavy leather glove, ignoring the searing heat of the fireplace, and reached into the flames. He gripped the heavy iron handle on the side of the chest and, with a guttural yell, yanked it out of the fire, dragging it onto the stone hearth. The sudden drop in temperature as it hit the freezing cabin floor caused another violent reaction. The metal groaned and shrieked. A massive fissure appeared along the top seam where the lid met the base. The rust binding it together had finally shattered. Archer's heart hammered against his ribs. The cold, the hunger, the blizzard raging outside it all faded away. He grabbed his crowbar, wedged it into the freshly cracked seam, and pushed. With a sickening screech of ancient metal tearing against metal, the heavy lid gave way. It tipped backwards, slamming onto the floorboards with a thud that shook the entire cabin. Archer fell to his knees and looked inside. The mocking laughter of William and Aunt Beatrice vanished from his memory forever. What lay inside the rusted chest defied all logic, and it was about to turn his life and the history books completely upside down. The heavy iron lid crashed backward against the floorboards, kicking up a cloud of century-old dust and ash. Archer knelt in front of the open chest, his breath shallow, his hands shaking so violently he could barely hold his flashlight. The inside of the chest was perfectly dry, smelling sharply of oiled canvas, beeswax, and the unmistakable stale scent of preserved history. The inner walls of the iron box were lined with thick, tightly fitted boards of aromatic red cedar, completely untouched by the decades of saltwater corrosion that had ravaged the exterior. Archer reached in. The top layer consisted of 3 heavy, oilcloth sacks tightly bound with brittle leather cords. They were astonishingly heavy. He dragged the first sack out onto the hearth. His frostbitten fingers struggled with the knot, so he took his pocket knife and sliced through the leather. A cascade of dull, yellow stones spilled out onto the ash-covered stones. They weren't coins, they weren't polished jewelry, they were raw, irregular chunks of metal ranging from the size of marbles to the size of a human fist. Archer picked one up. It was terrifyingly dense, cold, and pockmarked. Even in the dim, flickering light of the dying fire, there was no mistaking the heavy, buttery luster. It was raw, unrefined gold. Placer gold. Archer's mind raced. His grandfather had been a marine salvage expert in the 1980s, obsessed with the Pacific coastline. He tore open the second sack, then the third, more gold. Dozens of pounds of it, likely dredged from the ocean floor. By modern market rates, Archer was staring at easily $3 or $4 million in raw bullion. The crushing weight of his mother's medical debt, the eviction notices, the threat of bankruptcy, it all evaporated in the span of 30 seconds. But the gold wasn't the true treasure. Beneath the sacks, resting at the very bottom of the cedar-lined cavity, was a heavy, cylindrical tube made of solid lead, sealed with a thick cap of maritime wax. Next to it lay a small, leather-bound journal. Archer picked up the journal. The leather was stiff, the pages crisp. On the first page, in his grandfather, Theodore's erratic, looping handwriting, was a message dated the 14th of October, 1998. Archer, if you are reading this, it means you didn't take the easy way out. You didn't sell the box to a scrapyard. You pushed through the rust, just like I hoped you would. Your cousin William would have hired a locksmith, failed, and dumped it in a landfill. Beatrice would have fainted at the smell. But you know how to get your hands dirty. In 1986, my crew secretly located a debris field off the coast of Juneau, Alaska. It was a secondary wreckage scatter from the SS Islander, the steamer that went down in 1901 carrying Klondike gold. But this chest wasn't on the official manifest. It belonged to a private syndicate of railroad barons. The gold in those sacks was their walking money. The real power is in the lead tube. Keep your mouth shut, hire a shark of a lawyer, and take back what this family lost. Archer broke the wax seal on the lead tube and twisted the cap off. Inside, tightly rolled, was a sheaf of pristine, watermarked documents. They were intricate, printed on heavy vellum, featuring the ornate, engraved borders of early 20th century financial instruments. They were original, unregistered bearer bonds and sweeping land patents issued by the Northern Pacific Railway in 1898. Because they were bearer instruments, meaning whoever physically possessed them owned the underlying assets and had never been reported destroyed, they were still legally binding. And attached to these bonds were the perpetual, subsurface mineral and development rights to massive tracts of land in the Pacific Northwest. Archer stared at the coordinates and the city grids mapped out on the century-old vellum. His blood ran cold, then hot with a sudden, dizzying realization. He recognized the township maps. The patents covered several dozen city blocks in downtown Portland. the exact same city blocks where his cousin William's massive multi-million-dollar commercial high-rises were currently sitting. A sharp crack of wind against the cabin window snapped Archer back to reality. He might be a multi-millionaire on paper, but he was still trapped in a freezing cabin with a dead fire and a raging blizzard outside. He couldn't spend a dime if he froze to death. Driven by a sudden, fierce will to survive, Archer turned back to the chest. The heavy iron was useless, but the thick, dry red cedar lining inside the box was a different story. He grabbed his crowbar, wedged it behind the cedar panels, and violently pried them loose. The dry, aged wood splintered beautifully. He stacked the cedar boards into the hearth and struck his last match. The wood caught instantly, burning bright and hot, filling the freezing cabin with the scent of pine and salvation. Archer huddled over the flames, the raw Klondike gold piled haphazardly next to his boots, clutching the lead tube to his chest. For 2 more days, the storm raged. Archer burned every scrap of the chest lining, followed by his own clothes, keeping the fire barely alive. Finally, on the morning of the 10th day, the wind died. The sun broke through the clouds, glaring blindingly off the 4 feet of fresh snow. Archer packed his pockets with as many gold nuggets as he could physically carry, strapped the lead cylinder to his back using torn strips of his sleeping bag, and kicked the cabin door open. Using 2 broken floorboards and some wire, he fashioned crude snowshoes and began the agonizing 3-mile trek down the mountain to the main logging road. 6 hours later, severely dehydrated, suffering from frostnip on his nose and fingers, Archer flagged down a state snowplow clearing the mountain pass. The driver took one look at the hollow-eyed, freezing man and immediately radioed for an ambulance. Archer didn't let go of his backpack once. 3 weeks had passed since the state snowplow had rescued a half-frozen Archer Pendleton from the snowy ridges of the Cascade Mountains. Now, the atmosphere inside the sprawling, glass-walled conference room of Sander and Partners in downtown Seattle was electric, with an entirely different kind of tension. Outside, a crisp, blinding winter sun reflected off the skyscrapers, a stark contrast to the gloomy, rain-soaked day when Archer had first been handed his grandfather's so-called garbage. Archer sat at the head of the massive mahogany table. He was unrecognizable from the desperate, grease-stained mechanic who had occupied the corner seat a month prior. He wore a sharply tailored, bespoke charcoal gray suit that fit his lean frame perfectly. His hands rested quietly on the polished wood. They were still heavily scarred, the tips of his fingers a raw mottled pink from the severe frostbite he had endured, but they were perfectly steady. He radiated the quiet, terrifying stillness of a man who had stared death in the face and walked away holding all the cards. Flanking Archer was a formidable new vanguard. To his right sat Dr. Harrison Caldwell, a senior historical appraiser from Sotheby's, wearing a tweed jacket and meticulously adjusting a pair of wire-rimmed glasses. To his left was Sarah Jenkins, a senior partner at one of the most ruthless corporate litigation firms on the West Coast, accompanied by 2 junior associates carrying thick, intimidating briefcases. Across the table, David Sander, the estate lawyer, looked profoundly uncomfortable, his eyes darting nervously between the parties. Next to him, William Croft was aggressively pacing the length of the room, his expensive Italian leather shoes clicking sharply against the hardwood floor. His face was flushed with a mixture of immense annoyance and poorly concealed anxiety. Aunt Beatrice sat rigidly in her chair, wrapped tightly in a designer trench coat, aggressively stirring a cup of black coffee she hadn't taken a single sip of. "This is an absolute farce," William finally snapped, coming to a halt and slamming his palm flat against the glass-top table. "You disappear into the woods for a few weeks, miraculously don't freeze to death, and now you drag us all back here? What is this, Artie? A shakedown? I inherited the Portland commercial estate free and clear. Grandfather's will explicitly stated it. You got the rusty box. He bequeathed you the commercial properties, William," Archer said, his voice dropping into a calm, leveled baritone that commanded the large room. "The buildings, the concrete, the glass. But he never owned the foundational land patents beneath them. Neither did the people he bought them from. The title history of that entire district has a massive, undocumented blind spot dating back to 1901. William barked a harsh, dismissive laugh. "A blind spot? Are you out of your mind? My holding company spent millions on title searches before we developed those high-rises." Archer simply nodded to Dr. Caldwell. The historian cleared his throat and unrolled a massive, high-resolution copy of a century-old vellum document, placing it gently on the center of the table. "Mr. Croft," Dr. Caldwell began, his tone academic and precise. "In August of 1901, The SS Islander sank off the coast of Alaska. Officially, it was carrying Klondike gold. But unofficially, it was also transporting a private, heavily armored lockbox for a syndicate of railroad barons. The raw gold inside which Archer miraculously recovered was merely their travel capital. The true asset was a series of unregistered bearer bonds and sweeping land patents issued by the Northern Pacific Railway in 1898. Because they were bearer instruments, whoever physically holds them owns the underlying subsurface and developmental rights. They were presumed lost at sea for over a century. They were not. Aunt Beatrice scoffed loudly, waving a hand in the air. Fairy tales? You expect us to believe that a piece of waterlogged paper from over a century ago means anything today? Sarah Jenkins, the litigator, leaned forward, her eyes locking onto William like a hawk spotting a field mouse. It means absolutely everything, Mrs. Croft. As the legal physical owner of these developmental patents, my client holds the exclusive subsurface rights to 32 city blocks in downtown Portland. The exact blocks where your cousin's multi-million-dollar commercial high-rises currently sit. William stopped pacing entirely. The blood slowly began to drain from his face, leaving him a sickly pale. So what? You own some antique dirt? The city's zoning board isn't going to let you tear down $100 million worth of commercial real estate to dig for coal, Archer. I'll tie you up in litigation for the next 40 years. We have no intention of digging, Jenkins corrected smoothly, opening a thick manila folder and sliding a stack of heavy legal filings across the table. And we don't need to fight you for 40 years. We only needed to file these injunctions this morning with the United States District Court for the Western District of Washington. Furthermore, we took the liberty of notifying your title insurance providers of the conflicting claim. David Sander, the estate attorney, gasped audibly, a sound of pure, unfiltered professional terror. He understood exactly what Jenkins had just done. What does that mean? William demanded, his voice cracking. The arrogant smirk completely wiped from his face. Sander? What did she just say? It means, Jenkins interjected before Sander could even open his mouth, her voice dripping with lethal corporate grace, that your title insurance policies are now effectively suspended pending federal review. Your properties are officially classified as heavily contested, high-risk assets. And because your hedge fund heavily leveraged those exact properties, using them as collateral for $140 million in mezzanine loans, you are currently in violation of your debt covenants. The silence in the boardroom was absolute, heavy, and suffocating. The financial reality hit William like a freight train. The banks are going to call in your loans. Mr. Croft, Jenkins finished softly, closing her folder. Immediately. They will demand full repayment by the end of the business week. You are in debt. As of 9 o'clock this morning, your empire is insolvent. You're going to bankrupt me, William whispered, his legs finally giving out as he collapsed into his plush leather chair. He stared at Archer, his eyes wide with sheer, unadulterated horror. Over a petty grudge? Artie, please. We're family. You laughed while I was facing homelessness, William, Archer replied, his tone entirely devoid of sympathy or warmth. You sat in this exact room and mocked the only thing our grandfather left me. You told me to use my last few dollars for gas to haul it to a scrapyard. You saw rust, dirt, and decay. But Grandpa knew I'd look deeper. He knew I wouldn't stop until I broke through the surface. Archer stood up slowly, meticulously buttoning his suit jacket. He looked down at the people who had treated him like a peasant for his entire adult life. I've already liquidated the raw Klondike gold at a private Sotheby's auction, Archer continued, his voice ringing with absolute authority. It netted $4.2 million. I paid off my mother's medical debts, I bought back my repair shop, and I took the remaining $3 million and established a legal war chest strictly dedicated to enforcing these century-old land patents against your holding company. He walked toward the door, his footsteps heavy and deliberate, pausing just behind William's chair. I am offering you a singular, non-negotiable buyout, William. I will officially lease you the development rights for the Portland properties so the banks don't seize your buildings and liquidate your life. The cost of this lease will be exactly 90% of your gross rental income in perpetuity. You will effectively work for me for the rest of your natural life. Aunt Beatrice began to weep openly, burying her face into her cashmere scarf, her manicured hands trembling violently. If you refuse, Archer whispered, leaning down so only William could hear the terrifying finality in his voice, I will drag you through federal court until the banks seize your commercial properties, your vacation homes, your sports cars, and that fake Rolex on your wrist. Archer didn't wait for an answer. He didn't need to. The utter, soul-crushing defeat radiating from William was answer enough. He turned his back on his ruined family and walked out of the mahogany-paneled room. He stepped into the glass elevator, the doors sliding shut with a satisfying click. As he rode down to the ground floor, he looked out over the sprawling city of Seattle. The towering skyscrapers didn't look like imposing, insurmountable monoliths of a world he was excluded from anymore. They looked like an empire. And Archer Pendleton finally held all the keys. If you loved this incredible story of survival, hidden history, and ultimate revenge, don't keep it to yourself. Hit that like button to support the channel, share this video with someone who loves a massive plot twist, and make sure to subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss out on our next deep dive into real-life mysteries. What would you have done with the chest? Comment below.